Thank you. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I'm kind of a newcomer to this academic psychedelia. Came to Brigham, I mentioned 2 years ago as a literature graduate. Like you said, just finished a master's project on Aldous Huxley. But before I sort of landed in Greenwich, I had no idea that all these amazing conversations were going on, kind of beyond disciplines and transcending disciplines. So for 2 years of quite rigorous catching up to do. And what I've noticed is that Huxley is such a ubiquitous presence in these psychedelic conversations that we almost forget to talk about him. He's probably quoted more than any other figure, particularly in the medical and scientific tracks, which has always become this sort of symbol of intellectual legitimacy. You know, he's called upon whenever we need a sophisticated aphorism about psychedelics. And he's just so much more than that. I think with Huxley, there's a bit of a misconception that he was this great literary figure, and then in 1953 he took mescaline with Humphrey Osmond, had all these amazing, profound insights that became the doors of perception. That's how it kind of looks in isolation, but it wasn't really like that. My perception is that that work isn't really the outcome of mescaline. I mean, it is, but to a much lesser degree than we might like to imagine. All the real pivotal notions in there about, sort of philosophy and non-dualism and language, they're already there in his earlier novels and essays. So for that reason, I think he has a lot more to contribute to our conversations than just his acute work on psychedelics, beyond his flannel trousers and bamboo chair legs. And to those of you familiar with the sort of famous psychedelic chair moment, I strongly suspect now that that's just a footnote to Alfred North Whitehead. I found an uncannily similar description of a chair in a book called Symbolism from 1927. He was there. So Huxley spent 10 years thinking about psychedelics, but he spent his whole career trying to expose this sort of false dichotomy between science and spirituality and explore the limitations of language. So what I want to do for the next 20 minutes is just turn him into a human being again, put some of his ideas into context, and then I'll mention some of his semantic techniques. Okay. So a moment of biography. Huxley was really born into this world of science versus spirituality. His grandfather was, of course, Thomas Huxley, who famously supported Darwin's theories. Slightly less famous is his great uncle on his mother's side, which is Matthew Arnold, Victorian essayist and poet. Matthew Arnold is what's known as a sage writer, which is basically someone who tries to bring ancient wisdom to contemporary issues. And quite unusually, writing in the mid-1800s, he really deconstructed the word God. He saw it as a poetic term rather than the name of a being. This was a man who really understood the sort of the social and psychological importance of spirituality and its public narrative. So we have Arnold's influence on Aldous alongside that of Thomas Huxley. And I imagine that most of us here have felt that conflict before in our education and our influences, sort of hard science and this not so hard science. But with Huxley, it seems particularly tangible, I suppose, just given the proximity of these two intellectual giants. There were also a lot of difficulties in Huxley's younger years. At 14, he lost his mother. At 17, he contracted an eye disease that left him pretty much blind for 3 years. And then at 20, his brother Trevenant committed suicide after a period of depression. So perhaps unsurprisingly, his early work's really sort of saturated with cynicism. I won't sort of dwell on that period. I mean, he himself sort of attributes this worldview to his personal traumas, but I won't dwell on this. It's really after Brave New World for me in the mid-30s that his work gets a lot more interesting, when he has a much more optimistic view of human potential. But it's important to understand that this really compromised his credibility at the time, his reputation as a novelist. It was somewhat dependent on this gloomy satire. Insightful ideas and wise characters don't necessarily make good stories. People like satire, they like dystopia. unfortunately didn't deter him too much. So, to get a fuller picture of the philosophies that he developed, it's important to understand some of his main influences. And one of these was D.H. Lawrence. They were really good friends. They used to go on holidays together. They spent a winter in Switzerland together. And it's kind of an odd combination. You have Huxley, sort of withdrawn introvert, and D.H. Lawrence, this extroverted, passionate sensualist. Huxley commented that where he would merely think his opinions, Lawrence would live them. And it was an important friendship because it was really Lawrence who convinced Huxley that self-realization must incorporate the physical. We can't just rely on intellectual abstractions and sort of academic interactions. And he became really critical, Huxley did, he became really critical of things like academic conferences. He just found them too abstracted. I think he'd like this one now, to be honest. And the same with academia in general. He felt it was too specialised. We don't put enough emphasis on just general wisdom and being human. Where was it? There we go. Yeah, he felt it was best service as a generalist. He was extremely well read. He actually had a suitcase specially made so that he could carry the Encyclopedia Britannica on holiday with him. So he really knew how to relax, clearly. But despite this, like I say, he never claimed to be a formal specialist in anything. He kind of wanted to be seen as a generalist, and he felt that was an undervalued role in our society. Igor Stravinsky once described him as a kind of handy neighborhood university, and apparently he used to play this game of Stump the Professor. And Stravinsky would call Aldous up with all these obscure questions like, Aldous, what is the history of scissors? So I don't know what Stravinsky sounded like. But apparently Huxley usually had the answer. And then on the scientific side of the prolific, he was friends with Edwin Hubble. And apparently he and Huxley had these long conversations about physics and the expansion of the universe at parties. Apparently Stravinsky found this just really tedious and irritating. Another one of Huxley's big influences was Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti has a really weird and wonderful biography worth looking into if you get a chance. Very briefly, as a 14-year-old, he was on the beach in Chennai, India, but Madras at the time. And he was discovered by Charles Leadbeater and chosen to become this world teacher who was going to lead mankind into a brighter future. But during his spiritual education, he actually came to reject the concept of gurus. Although he's a public speaker and a philosopher, he'd often say, I am not your guru. And this influenced Huxley very much, and they became lifelong friends after they met in 1938, I think. We could pick it apart and say, well, where exactly do you draw the line between a guru and a teacher? But Huxley felt comfortable in that distinction. And this anti-guru message, it comes up a lot in his work. There's some quote somewhere. There's no such thing as the way. There are many paths up the mountain. As he quite famously says in Ireland, give us this day our daily faith, but deliver us, dear God, from belief. Huxley felt that establishing gurus is what ultimately leads to religious hierarchies. He found worship in general very problematic. Because if you use that as your means of spiritual growth, then you're going to get trapped in dualities and divisions. Because to raise up the sacred is to divide it. So at times there's this really playful way of discussing God and death and spirit. In Time Must Have a Stop, some of these characters refer to God as the gaseous vertebrate. And alongside that, there's comical seance scenes. And one of them, this rather pompous guy, Eustace Barnett, he's recently died, and he's sort of trying to communicate through a medium, but to his annoyance, she keeps sort of misquoting him. It's kind of a weird scene. You've got like a group of them having this seance, and they're having this really inane conversation about like marriage in the spirit realm. And Eustace sort of like thinks he's a bit of a ladies' man. So he tries to be like, oh, I'm not the one thinking about marriage. I don't know what the imbecile medium uttered was, we don't think about marriage over here. He gets increasingly annoyed about these mistranslations from the medium into the sort of normal world. And it's a bit of playful relief, but I think this approach really reflects this idea of the spiritual being here on this level. You know, it's not something upstairs that we should pray to, it's here, and any illusion of separation, it's just a problem in communication. The sort of negative side of that, I suppose it could be a shortcut to cultural appropriation, as we talk about a lot. Are you carving your own path to self-realization, or are you just sort of cherry-picking bits of wisdom that sound good? I always think of it like making a best of Fleetwood Mac collection before you've listened to all the albums. It's difficult, but certainly Huxley's own research into his perennial philosophy, it was extremely meticulous. But we're also not to take Huxley's advice too seriously. If we sort of blindly follow him in rejecting gurus, then he just becomes this guru of anti-guruism, and the whole thing's just nonsense. Rather, we should take a tour around his thoughts and just use them as a departure point. So it's from this Krishnamurti nexus, I suppose, that he develops his ideas about non-meditation. He believed that you don't have to stop doing anything to meditate, you simply have to be present in the thing that you're doing. He felt that it was too easy for formal meditation to become just another form of ego reinforcement, spiritual one-upmanship, and so people out-meditating each other. And the same with philosophy. He thought that just memorizing a load of like Buddhist teaching or Vedanta, it was just another way to inflate your ego and show how cultured and intelligent you are. It doesn't really mean anything. He just really saw how spirituality, and particularly Eastern spirituality, was at risk of being commodified. Of course, he'd always been extremely critical of consumer culture and modern entertainment. Woolworths gets an absolute slating in Heaven and Hell. And imagine this was exacerbated by living in California. He spent the sort of afternoon of his life there. Speaking of modern amusements, there's a nice little anecdote from his screenwriting days in Hollywood. He wasn't a very successful screenwriter. But Walt Disney once employed him to work on the script for Alice in Wonderland. And he says, I hired Mr. Huxley to write a part for Lewis Carroll, but he was brainy. The second day, he handed me a 10-page outline of what should be done. It was so literary, I could only understand every third word. If you want to work in Hollywood, it's not good to have brains. Walt Disney said that. Incredible. But I find this anecdote really interesting because Huxley was certainly capable of accessible language. I think he would have been quite good at this sort of paradoxical wordplay that we find in Alice in Wonderland. Huxley's mother actually knew Lewis Carroll as a child. He has a poem about her, which the name escapes me. Do you know? No, I'm looking at you. I suspect that he was being literary to make a point. Okay, so somewhat tenuously links us to his semantic techniques. So Huxley was obsessed with the limitations of language. And this idea of ineffability comes up in nearly every conversation about psychedelics. But it's important to understand that describing something as ineffable, it's still describing it. Beyond words, it's still a verbal description. And Huxley found ineffability in all direct experience. For him, it wasn't just a problem in describing altered states. Language is always incommensurable with the facts, and psychedelics just make this problem more obvious. Virginity of mind, he says, will not be discovered in a context of predetermined beliefs and dogmas. Interestingly, in one of his essays, he talks about the Virgin Mary, but rather the symbol of the Virgin, as being a mind without dogma, out of which the enlightened one is born. And for Huxley, fundamental to this was getting past language. A bit difficult when you're a writer, though. So for me, his real contribution is this idea that, yes, language is limited, but it's not all equally limited. And he had some sort of favourite ways of demonstrating this, sort of stretching the reach of language. I'm only going to mention a couple, but I do have a slightly fanatical list of about sort of 20 ones that he uses all the time, with examples if anyone's feeling keen. So one thing we have is foreign terminology. He'll throw in words and phrases from all different languages. And on the one hand, it highlights this idea that, yes, language is the label and we have all these to choose from. But I think foreign words, they keep your concepts more flexible. If you don't quite know what a word means, but you gather a sense from the context, then it's much easier to avoid your own biases. But it's also not a blank slate. These words are still sort of historically rooted to a form or an archetype or whichever philosophical metaphor you prefer. So in his final novel, bear in mind this was only 1962, he doesn't go near the word psychedelic. It's all moksha, which is like sort of roughly Sanskrit for liberation, but it doesn't actually translate that neatly. Another technique that he uses a lot is capitalization. Of course, he wasn't the first to do this. The Romantics distinguished between nature big N and nature small n. And we have Jung's famous capitalization of self. But Huxley uses it all the time, everywhere. And he does it when he wants to emphasize the event and not the subject. For example, he'll capitalize the word fever if fever is the thing that's dominating the moment. So this is from After Many a Summer, published in 1939. He says, one of his characters says, "The words are quite untrue, for it was not I who lay at death's door, nor is it I who am recovered. The first was a special creation of fever, capital F, an embodiment of pain, capital P, and lassitude, capital L, etc." It's a good technique for exposing the sort of fallacy of a consistent perceiving subject, and it really makes you imagine the scene in a different way. Another semantic technique that he uses is context. It explicitly signals context. In Point Counterpoint, his 1928 novel, D.H. Lawrence character says, "What I say is what I say. It becomes quite different when you say it." He actively reminds you that language is always contextually bound, and we know this intellectually, but it's so easy to forget when you're sort of reading and you're in the moment. Again, I think Whitehead framed a lot of this thinking too. Language is a sort of organism within its environment. A lot of these little semantic tips and sort of techniques, they're framed within conversations as well. A really good way of avoiding sort of long, meandering descriptions of exceptional human experience, the type that we get in trip reports, be a bit more digestible as a dialogue. Okay, so there's just one final stylistic element that I want to mention, and that's the way he uses scientific language. What he does, he'll juxtapose emotion with the language of biology and chemistry. It comes up in Ireland, but he's doing it back in the 20s as well. In Point Counterpoint, there's a character, Lord Edward, and he suddenly hears this melody by Bach, and he describes his experience like this. He says, "The shaking air rattled Lord Edward's membrana tympani. The interlocked malus, incus, and stirrup bones were set in motion so as to agitate the membrane of the oval window and raise an infinitesimal storm in the fluid of the labyrinth." It's nonsense, meaningless. But he comes back to this method again and again to show the limitations of scientific language, to demonstrate why we need art to not as an afterthought, not as a luxury. Huxley was really concerned about this perceived hierarchy between science and the arts. It still pervades culture today, and I think possibly this community is no different. I mean, most of the public engagement with psychedelics, it comes through psychiatry and neuroscience, and it's tactful and it's just wonderful work, but I just wonder whether it's enough for something as complex and multifaceted as psychedelics, especially when their reputation and even their effects, they're so tied up in narratives and semantics. These narratives shape our expectations. So, these drugs, medicines, teachers, they show us the limits of Western science. They're Their most interesting aspects are things that can't be measured. The mystical element, for example, I know we have the scale of mystical experience, which is really useful for the data, but we know that it's a fairly absurd concept. I mean, most of our sort of modern understandings of, well, the definition of mystical comes from William James. But when you actually read William James, he has a very tentative approach to the subject. It might even be fundamental that we don't really know what mystical means. So there's certainly no mysticometer that's going to measure it. And similar with experiences of love and beauty, they're essentially just words, and sometimes we agree on some approximate definition. We need art to tackle these subjects. So, a few final thoughts on psychedelics. I hope you'll excuse the oversimplification here, but I think the road we're on now, it's much closer to Huxley's model than to Timothy Leary's. Not that those are the only two models, but just reduce it temporarily. But because of who Huxley influenced, he's often misrepresented. This countercultural legacy that he left behind, it's so far from who he was and how he'd want to be remembered. In his final few years, he became very critical of Leary. He felt that Leary was presenting psychedelics as a panacea, which isn't necessarily true, but that's how Huxley put it to Humphrey Osmond in a letter. And Huxley didn't even believe in panaceas theoretically. I quite enjoy it's become a little bit of a modern mantra, these substances are not a panacea. In an interview in 1961, Huxley claimed to have taken mescaline twice and LSD about 5 times, I suppose. I haven't had a chance to look at the archives yet, but I've just come back from the Aldous Huxley conference, and the sort of consensus amongst the scholars who'd recently been in the archives was that actually Huxley had a lot more psychedelic experiences than he publicly admitted to. Even in this interview, he neglects to mention the psilocybin study that he took part in with Leary at MIT. It makes perfect sense to me that you'd play this down, sort of like cooling the message to account for the fiery media. Rightly or wrongly, Huxley didn't believe that psychedelics should be freely available to everyone. In a conversation a few weeks ago, Rob sort of described his psychedelic spirituality as a trickle-down mysticism. I really see how it looks that way, but I prefer to think of it as sort of extreme caution. He felt that sort of this restricted distribution was simply the price we have to pay for the fact that our culture isn't ready. I think that's what we're doing here, sort of building the infrastructure for the responsible use of psychedelics across different contexts. It all becomes delightfully normalized at an event like this. I think a bit of Huxleyan caution will serve as well, as will reflecting on his ideas about dogmas and dominant narratives. It's important that we don't get tunneled into any single track of psychedelics as sacred or psychedelics as therapy. As we've been hearing, there are many, many useful contexts, and some of them do include fun and recreation, but they're the ones that need a bit more sort of semantic care and attention. I think that Aldous Huxley, this great wordsmith and collector of wisdom, can help us to build these narratives and synthesize them, balance them. Once again, from Ireland, give us this day our daily faith, but deliver us, dear God, from belief. Thank you.